Welcome to week 33 of our preaching teaching series, Unpacking Red Gone White. Our message this week is called Transforming Failures into Fuel. This is Apostle David Anderson of Red Gone White Church, where transformation begins. If you are just discovering this series, let me welcome you to the final segment of a 40-week preaching teaching series. This is the second of 9 messages that will focus on God's transforming power in our lives. Let's jump right into this week's message. God in nature uses death and decay and feeds the soil to create fertilizer as food and fuel for future growth. He also takes waste and defecation and, once again, feeds and fuels future growth. Nothing is ever wasted with God. From a human perspective, it has also been said that God never wastes a hurt. Failures, pain, letdowns, and loss in our lives don't just stay there. There's always a benefit, a blessing, a lesson we can learn, a gift we can gain along the way. By experiencing pain, loss, and or failure personally, a few things happen. We gain empathy. We know what it feels like, and we can connect with others in pain. So we become less quick to judge others for their loss, failures, or setbacks. We also gain experience. When it comes to gaining wisdom, there is nothing quite like going through something personally. We see situations intimately and in high-definition detail. We can become somewhat of a guide or a coach. A guide is someone who has gone ahead of us and is very familiar with the lay of the land. The guide knows what are the threats and how to deal with them, and also what are the resources and how to access them. A coach has studied the game and has played it and has failed and succeeded along the way. The coach has strategies and vision and can steer others to mindsets, habits, and activities that help them win in life. This series is stemming from when God spoke audibly to me in 2014. He simply said, "Red Gone White." Learn more about this moment by clicking a link in the description portion about the story behind the name. But I have learned along the way that God is trying to communicate that His ways are transformational. We addressed this head-on in our Week 1 message called It's About Transformation. Life is filled with cycles and paradoxes. Night turns to day, day turns to night. The end of one thing becomes the beginning of another. If we've never felt pain or sorrow, then we cannot fully experience or appreciate joy or happiness. In order to prosper and succeed in one area of our lives, we often have to sacrifice, go without, or suffer in another area of our lives. One of the most famous scriptures addressing these cycles and paradoxes is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Listen. So verse 1, "For everything there is a season, and time for every purpose under heaven." Verse 2, "A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted." Verse 3, "A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up." Verse 4, "A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance." Verse 5, "A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing." Verse 6, "A time to seek, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away." Verse 7, "A time to rend, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak." Verse 8, "A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace." Be encouraged to know that whatever we are going through, God is able to use it for our gain and or for His glory. The best leaders in life were first the best followers. So, those of us who learned from others and listened to guidance and allowed others to help us are the ones who are the most effective at teaching and benefiting others. Jesus himself is a great example of this. He is the greatest leader to ever walk the face of the earth. But on many occasions, he was quick to tell us that he only does what the Father shows him, and he only says what the Father tells him to say. On that note, I wish to take the remaining portion of this week's lesson to focus on one of Jesus' most impactful and influential leaders, the Apostle Peter. Peter was first a follower of Christ before he was a leader for Christ. But before he was the great Apostle Peter, he was a failure. We're going to look closely at 4 significant failures of his, and yet all of these became fuel for the great success he would later experience. Let's go. I will quickly list them here. Then, as time allows, I will do my best to open them up for the purposes of our message this week. Here are 4 significant and documented failures of Peter. 1. He sank while trying to walk on water. 2. He was called Satan by Jesus himself. 3. He cut off a man's ear and was rebuked for it by Jesus. 4. He openly and publicly denied even knowing Jesus in his darkest hour. Not 1 time or 2 times, but 3 times. In chapter 6 of the book of Mark, we hear the story of Jesus sending out his disciples onto the Sea of Galilee as they get hopelessly caught in a torrential storm. Many of these men, including Peter, were seasoned fishermen, yet they all feared for their lives. Suddenly, Jesus appears before them as he's casually walking on the surface of the water, as though he were about to walk right past them. But they cried out to him, and he answered, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." In Matthew 14:28, the story picks up from there, but also shows us what happened before Jesus climbed into the boat with them. Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." In verse 29, Jesus tells him to come. For the sake of time, I will summarize what follows. While Peter was fixated on the face and the person of Jesus, he was literally walking on the water as well. But the wind and the waves grabbed his attention. He was brought back to the reality of his situation. He focused too much on his crisis and not enough on his Christ, and he began to sink. So, Peter is often remembered for failing to walk on water, but he was the only one, at least, willing to try, and even succeeded temporarily. Another noteworthy moment of failure for Peter was on the heels of one of his most epic moments. Let's go to the book of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 15 through 18. Jesus had been asking his disciples, "Who do people think he is?" Then in verse 15, he turns to Peter and says, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Verse 17, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Verse 18, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Simon refers to a rock, but Peter refers to a bedrock. A bedrock is massive and foundational and can be built upon. What an awesome moment for Peter. And yet, only minutes later, he went from hero to zero in barely 10 seconds. Jesus goes on to predict his own suffering and death and resurrection. But listen to Peter's reaction and Jesus' response to that reaction. Still in Matthew chapter 16, now verse 22. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." Verse 23. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So just like that, the bedrock is reduced to a stumbling block. Let me take us to the Garden of Gethsemane, just before Jesus is abducted by the Pharisees to be tortured and killed. Peter was a man's man, and fearless in his ways, and he was a fisherman by trade. So he was accustomed to carrying a knife on him, and he was accustomed to keeping it sharp enough to fillet a fish. When Jesus was being seized, Peter reacted by cutting off the ear of Malchus, one of the high priest's servants. Jesus responded by rebuking Peter and by healing Malchus's ear. In Matthew 26:52, immediately after Peter does this, Jesus says, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." Verse 53. "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" Verse 54. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? Notice how the great Apostle Peter keeps screwing up. He was a man, prone to make mistakes, just like each of us. Finally, we know that in the same gathering when he went from hero to zero, he was also told that before the sun rose the next day that he would deny Jesus 3 times. Once again, for the sake of time and our purposes, I will summarize. While Jesus was in captivity and being beaten, scourged, and humiliated, Peter was nearby but watching. It was dark, and he was trying to blend in with other people who were nearby. But they kept recognizing him and saying, "Aren't you one of his followers?" But each time he would adamantly deny it. The 3rd time, he cursed and said that he didn't even know Jesus. In that exact moment, the rooster crowed for the 2nd time, as predicted by Jesus in Mark 14:30. And Peter's eyes met with Jesus' eyes, and Peter was cut to the core. Could such a man be used by God to launch the church age and establish the kingdom of God on earth? Yes. After Jesus' resurrection, he came back and spent many days with his disciples and taught openly again. But one of the first things he did was to forgive and to restore his relationship with Peter. In John chapter 21, verses 15 through 17, Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" But in the original language, Jesus used different textures of meaning to the word love. First, he is asking Peter, "Do you love me as you should love any human?" Then he asked, "Do you love me as a brother?" Finally, he asked, "Do you love me intimately and deeply?" In doing so, Jesus healed the brokenness between them, and then commissioned Peter to feed his sheep and to be their pastor. We later learn in the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 14 through 41, that Peter preached boldly and publicly after Jesus' crucifixion and won over 3,000 converts to the faith in his very first sermon. He became the first bishop, or leader of leaders of the church. He was imprisoned, beaten willingly and often for his faith, and he was a successful church planter, and ultimately was crucified upside down for his passionate and determined faith. I say all of this to illustrate that no failure is too big for God to forgive, and no loser is too low for God to raise up if he chooses to. All of these moments of failure and shortcoming became fuel for Peter. Being forgiven, being restored, being established and utilized despite his own foolishness and failure, turned his stumbling block moments into a bedrock passion for this marvelous God. Give our weaknesses, failures, setbacks, and stumblings to God, and let Him do what only He can do. Let them become fertilizer from which greatness sprouts. Join us next week as we look at transforming pain and setbacks into reasons. This is Apostle David Anderson of Red Gone White Church, where transformation begins.